Hello, welcome to the last panel of Democracy Days 2020. I want to give a shout out to Michael Kelker, who put all these fantastic panels together and put it all together into one cohesive event. He's done this for 20 years now, and it's just a fantastic opportunity for faculty, for students, and for the community members. So I want to give a shout out to Michael Kelker. My name is Paul Rosler. I'm political science faculty here. I'm joined with two other political science faculty, Lisa Randall and Gabe Harper. And we're going to talk about today the myth of voter fraud. But before we do, I'm going to start with a short clip from the President of the United States talking about this issue.
The time has come for voter ID, like everything else. Voter ID. You know, if you go out and you want to buy groceries, you need a picture on a card. You need ID. You go out and you want to buy anything, you need ID and you need your picture.
All right, I'm going to stop sharing. Lisa, would you like to go first?
Sure. Sure. And we're going to go to. Okie dokie. All right, guys. So my name is Lisa Randall. I am a political science professor at St. Charles Community College. And I'm going to talk about voting in the general election. I'm going to talk about mail-in voting, absentee voting, and in-person voting just briefly to let you know, as a potential voter in this election, what you need to do to be eligible and how easy and safe all of these different forms are. My presentation is called Young, Scrappy, and Hungry. I might be going through a Hamilton phase. It's really great, so there's that. Okay, so voting basics. Are you eligible and are you registered? In order to vote in the United States, you need to be a citizen and you need to be registered to vote. Most of you probably know whether or not you're registered to vote, but there are some of you who may not. If you do not know if you are registered to vote, there's a link posted right there below. It's a voting lookup tool to see if you are in fact registered and if your information is up to date. You have until October 5th of this year to update your information to make sure that you're eligible to vote in the general election. Different methods of voting: mail-in voting, absentee voting, and in-person voting. Mail-in voting. I put this one first because this is the one most talked about in the news and probably the most unnecessarily controversial. Mail-in voting was authorized on June 4th by the governor to enable people in Missouri to exercise their constitutional right without unduly risking themselves to contraction of COVID-19 coronavirus. To vote by mail, you must request a mail-in ballot by October the 25th. If you know that you are going to do this, do it now. Do not wait until the last minute. Procrastination is always bad, but in this situation is particularly bad because the sooner you can vote, the more sure you can be that your vote gets to the election authority by election day's vote tally. Once you get your mail-in ballot, you vote, and then you must have a notary sign your ballot and sign the envelope. There are special places on both like the actual ballot and the envelope where the notary has to sign. The purpose of this is to make sure that you are who you say you are. So you can't just go root through your neighbor's mail and get their mail-in ballot and pretend to be them and vote. That is illegal. That's a felony. And having a notary validate your identity is the Missouri Election Authority's way of making sure that you are voting legitimately. Absentee voting. Absentee voting can be the same as mail-in voting. Some absentee voting is done by mail and some is done in person. If you choose to do it by mail, the procedure is the same. You have to request an absentee ballot and give a good reason for voting absentee. Most people vote absentee because they have trouble getting off work. because they're high risk for COVID-19, or they know they're going to be out of the country, which is probably not real this time around because a lot of countries are not letting Americans in because we're all apparently sick. So there's that. If you want to vote absentee by mail, same thing as mail-in voting, you have to have your request to do this in by October 25th at 5 p.m. Just like mail-in voting, if you think you want to vote absentee or you think you fall into this category, request your ballot now. Do not wait. It is way better for your closure and for the system in general, for you to get things done sooner rather than later. It will be easier to count ballots if they don't all come in at the last minute. You can also vote absentee in person. If you want to do that, you need to contact your local election authority to find out where the absentee polling place is. I voted absentee in the 2012 election. I don't remember why. I was in Columbia for something. And I voted at the county courthouse on 2nd Street in St. Charles, but that is not in any way indicative that my place is your place. So make sure that if you want to vote absentee in person, that you contact your local election authority and find out where you're supposed to go. Absentee voting. Then in-person voting. This is my personal preference. I like voting in person. I'm really kind of a political nerd, and there is something exciting, a certain kind of energy and power you can feel in the room when people are there to vote. You can feel the power of democracy around you. And I'm not like over exaggerating or hyping that. There is something uniquely powerful about knowing that you and a whole bunch of people have come together with a unified purpose, the goal of making a difference. That's really special. And it's also one of the very, very many things in a ritual that I participate in on election day. I always have an election night party. Deborah Crank-Lewis from the history department brings her famous crab dip. I usually make some kind of snicky, snacky, sweet thing. Anyway, like election day is a special thing for me. And if I don't vote in person, it doesn't feel right. So there's that. Polls are open in Missouri from 6 a.m. to 7 p.m. Expect long lines. It is going to be a busy election. People on both sides of the fence are very motivated to vote. So do not expect to walk in and walk out. If you intend to vote in person, I would recommend making arrangements with your instructors, making arrangement with your place of employment, and let them know what you plan to do. Your place of employment cannot tell you you cannot leave to vote. That's against the law. And most of your instructors are going to be okay with it. If there's some kind of exam or something on election day, that might be a little dicey, but reach out to your instructors way in advance so they know that you're not just trying to get out of an exam. So there's that too. Missouri is a voter ID state, and that clip that Paul played at the beginning, voter ID laws are popping up all over the country. And what that means is that in order to vote, you have to bring a valid state issued or military ID with you to vote. Missouri is one of those states, which is interesting because there's a lot of polling places, a lot of precincts that don't enforce it. So the place that I vote is the Church of the Cross on Mid Rivers Mall Drive, right across from Old Town Donuts. And all they want to see is your voter card. They have never once asked me for my driver's license ever. And every time I've gone, it's been different election judges. So it's not like they know me. But there are places scattered across the state that are very nitpicky about that voter ID thing. So yes, bring your voter card, that's great, but make sure that you bring your driver's license or your state issued ID or your military ID, because without it, technically in the state of Missouri, they can tell you you have to go home and get it. And there were places in the 2016 election where people waited for 5 hours to vote. And I'm sure you don't want to have to do that twice. That sounds like awful. The facts about voter fraud. Voter fraud in the United States is super duper rare. I'm sure that Paul and Gabe will tell you when they give more detail on voter fraud. there is almost zero examples of voter fraud being real. And the fact that some people are trying to say voter fraud is not only not rare, but it's common is straight up lying to you. Voter fraud is almost non-existent in this country. Mail-in voting is very safe, and your votes are counted no matter who you vote for. If you're Republican and you're voting for Trump, or you're Democrat and you're voting for Biden, or you're Green Party and you're voting for Joe Jorgensen, your votes will be counted if you vote by mail. Absentee voting is very safe, and your votes are counted no matter who you vote for. In-person voting is very safe, minus the coronavirus thing. Wear a mask, and your votes are counted no matter who you vote for. I'm very, very confident in saying that because I have been myself part of the electoral process. I worked as an election judge before. It's really fun. They pay you a lot of money. When people sign in to vote, someone from both parties has to initial that you showed up. So it's not like it's only Republicans or only Democrats there. In Missouri, nobody registers according to political party. When you register to vote, you register as you. So I am Lisa Randall, and I registered to vote when I was 17 and a half. So I would be eligible when I was 18. There's no way for an election judge or anyone else to know based on your voter registration what party you voted for, who you voted for, or who you are likely to vote for. When votes are tallied, there are election judges from both parties, and both parties must certify the legitimacy of the results from that polling location before those votes are sent on. So there is no question about legitimacy if they are passed on. If there is anything shady going on, the election judges at a specific polling place will reach out to lawyers that they have that will contest the results of that election in that polling location. Like I said, this is super duper rare because they have that built-in check where both parties are there throughout the entire process. At every stage of the electoral process, representatives from both parties have to certify the election's legitimacy. So do not be conned into believing that the election is rigged or the results are altered in any way, because it's virtually impossible in the way that our system is set up in Missouri and all of the other states and all of the other territories to rig an election. The way we've done it, the way we've designed our electoral system is to prevent that from happening. In previous eras, back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, people from political parties would greet you as you walked in, and if they recognized you as a member of the opposition party, they would escort you out. Back then, politics and the electoral process was far more partisan than it is now. So know that you are safe, whether you vote by mail, whether you vote absentee, or whether you vote in person. Your vote will be counted, and it will be counted on time as long as you submit everything by the date it's supposed to be sent in by. Okay, all right, I'm good. Next person. Woo. I'm done.
Gabe, you want to step in?
I muted myself there, pardon me. So yeah, I was going to talk a little bit about the perception of vote fraud in the US between Republicans and Democrats, and almost kind of the alternate realities they can live in about how common vote fraud is in the US. And I'm going to explain why they think that. So conservatives tend to very much fear vote fraud. President Trump, and it seems like almost every speech he's given this year, has stated that he's afraid of widespread vote fraud occurring in the US, and he afraid the election's going to be stolen from him as a result of this vote fraud. And when you poll Americans on this issue, you find that conservatives, Republicans, are much more likely to believe that vote fraud is commonly occurring in the United States compared to Democrats, who seem to feel it's much more rare. And part of this is based on practical concerns for both political parties here in the United States. Historically, the Democratic Party has benefited when voter turnout is higher. And I'm simplifying things here a little bit, but basically there are more Democratic voters in the US than there are Republican voters. Polling consistently shows that. So theoretically, and this is going to vary a lot state to state, but theoretically, if you get higher voter turnout, that really makes it better for Democrats because there are more Democratic voters in the US, but Republicans tend to be more disciplined about actually showing up and voting. So when you increase voter turnout and you make it easier to vote, you're going to benefit Democratic candidates. And President Trump actually said in one of his speeches that if you allow for mail-in voting throughout the United States, that's the end of it for the Republican Party. Now, he might have been referring to vote fraud, or he might have been just making a practical argument that if you really encourage everybody to vote and make it super easy to vote by voting in your home, it's just going to benefit Democratic candidates overall. There's been some interesting research just in the last year or two that's shown that that might be changing, that high voter turnout might not always benefit Democratic candidates as much as it was assumed so in the past. But certainly the high-level people in both parties still seem to firmly believe higher voter turnout will benefit Democrats, lower voter turnout will benefit Republicans in the United States. So that partially helps to explain why Republicans seem to be really interested in the idea of vote fraud and really concerned about it, even though, like Lisa just said, it seems to be pretty rare in the United States and doesn't really seem to be happening a whole lot. At least if it is happening on a real widespread basis, people aren't getting caught. Let's put it that way. So there's no direct evidence that widespread voter fraud is occurring in the US. And it's easy to ascribe just really evil motives to your political opponents and say, oh, well, those Republicans, they just don't want people to go out and vote. And with a few Republicans, that might be true. I do believe that most Republicans truly do believe vote fraud is happening in the United States. They've really believed in this, even though there's not a whole lot of evidence to directly support it. They do truly believe in that, and they believe in keeping the ballots secure and safe. And so they may have honorable goals, at least in some cases, to make sure that vote fraud is not happening in the United States on a widespread basis. And I understand if you want to take some basic steps to try to make our vote more secure, make sure people aren't voting out other people's names, those are reasonable concerns to have in the United States. Liberals, on the other hand, want to increase voter turnout as much as possible, partially because, like we just said, liberals believe everybody should just have the right to vote. Getting the right to vote for non-white persons, getting the right to vote for women was a key goal of progressive political movements in the US going back hundreds of years at this point in the United States. So there's a longstanding belief in progressivism that we need to make sure everybody has the right to vote, and right to vote should certainly not be denied on things like basis of race or gender. And Democrats also, though, I must say, have a practical thing here. They believe by increasing the voter turnout in the United States, they can make it easier for Democratic candidates to win for the reasons we just talked about. So there's also a bit of an ulterior motive going on here for liberals as well. We increase the voter turnout, we're going to make it more likely that liberal candidates are going to win. And you can see it's really playing out in the debate over mail-in ballots today, which Lisa talked about. Liberals tend to be very much of the idea that you should be able to mail in your ballot from your home. There are several states like Colorado, Washington, Oregon, Utah, and Hawaii, I think, are the 5 states that are doing it completely by mail. California is moving that way very rapidly. In those states, they've gotten rid of their polling places completely, which saves money. I appreciate that Lisa had a good time, helping out with the polling place and get paid for it. It's always nice as well. But I also understand the state government's going to save a lot of money if they don't have to pay these people to go out and work in the polling places on election day. It's actually a lot cheaper for your state just to mail out your ballots to everybody. People fill them out and then mail them back in. Right? It saves a lot of cost for the state governments. So liberals really want to try to make voting by mail easier in the US, but once again, conservatives fear that maybe your neighbor could get your ballot by accident or somebody else could steal it out of your mailbox and fill it out. Those things seem to be quite rare. Like Lisa said, voting by mail tends to be quite reliable and quite safe, but there are, I think in some cases, maybe legitimate concerns. Let's make sure that, ballots are kept secure, make sure people aren't using this, or make sure that people aren't misusing this vote by mail process to cast fraudulent votes. Those are reasonable concerns to have, at least. Also, I'll point out in this election, mail-in balloting is particularly important because of the COVID epidemic. And a lot of people don't feel comfortable standing around in large groups of other people. That's a reasonable concern now, but COVID itself has become political. Can you name me one subject in American society we talk about regularly that hasn't become politicized in some way, right? So COVID has become politicized like everything else in our society. Liberals tend to be much more fearful of the effects of the COVID virus here in the United States. So liberals, when they've done polling on this, are much more likely to say, I think I'll stay home and send in my vote by mail this year. Whereas conservatives, who tend to be less fearful of COVID, I'm not saying conservatives completely dismiss the threat of the COVID virus, but as a result of statements made by President Trump and other conservative commentators in the United States, they tend to believe that COVID is less of a threat to them and probably to society in general. So conservatives, when they've done polling here recently in the United States, it's shown that conservatives are more likely to show up and physically vote this year in the election with the COVID epidemic going on. So this has also become a dividing line between liberals and conservatives in that liberals are just much more likely to vote by mail. Conservatives are much more likely to come in and vote in person. And President Trump has really been emphasizing this issue of vote fraud in general and mail-in balloting, as we've talked about already today. President Trump has said repeatedly that he's afraid that the election is going to be stolen from him. There may also, not surprisingly, be an ulterior motive going on here as well. In that, if you look online, you see you can actually look at the betting odds on candidates winning elections. You probably are all aware that you can get online and bet on sporting events and things like that. You can also get online and vote on the outcome of political races. Now, this isn't going to be nearly as popular as laying money on who's going to win the Super Bowl this year or something, but you can do it. It is out there. I won't mention the name of the website, but there's a website you can get onto that's pretty popular where you can lay money on who's going to win, like the presidential election, which party is going to take control of the Senate, etc. And right now, I looked at this just yesterday. The betting odds right now on Joe Biden winning the election coming up this November is about 60%, with roughly 40% for Trump. So if you're laying money on it right now, odds are about 6-4 on Biden to win this thing. That's what the odds look like. This is what's interesting. Look at that same website. Look at the odds for who's going to win the popular vote in 2020 this year. The odds on that are running about 9-1 on Biden winning the popular vote. A lot of people seem to think that if President Trump wins this year, he won't win the popular vote, but he'll win in the Electoral College. So one, President Trump fears voter fraud and fears mail-in balloting because he's just afraid he might lose the election. As a result of it, also he may be saying that as a way to kind of cover himself if it looks like he is losing. Also, you might remember back in 2016, it really seemed to bother President Trump that he lost the popular vote to Hillary Clinton, right? He won the Electoral College, but he lost in the popular vote by about 2 percentage points to Hillary. And to this day, he still sometimes brings that up and says, I believe the vote was rigged. I think he believes it hurts his legitimacy as president that he didn't win the popular vote. He's really afraid of the same thing happening this year in 2020. So once again, like the betting odds say, they have it 9-1 that Biden's going to win the popular vote. If that happens, Biden wins the popular vote by maybe 2 or 3 percentage points, but Donald Trump wins the Electoral College again like he did in 2016. Once again, I think he fears that it's going to undermine his legitimacy as the president. And that's one of the reasons he's really trying to cast a lot of doubt on the validity of the vote this year in mail-in voting, because it's a way for him to almost cover himself if that same scenario plays out this year. He wins the Electoral College but loses the popular vote. He can say, well, it was all those false mail-in ballots. I actually won the popular vote. The American people support me, but if it wasn't for all that vote fraud going on, clearly I would have won the popular vote. And I think that's one of his motivations for really trying to undermine people's confidence in voting by mail and stirring up fears, of vote fraud in general in the United States. All right. Well, I think I'm done there, Paul.
All right. So it's my turn now. I will share my screen and hopefully get to work. Excellent. So my question today, what I'm going to tackle, is kind of similar to what Gabe was talking about, which is why you see such a difference between the parties on this issue of fear of voter fraud, and a lot of it has to do with politics. The definition I like to use in my class of politics is from Harold Laswell. Politics is who gets what, when, and how. And a lot of times politicians and Congress and the president often like to battle over the who gets what in terms of spending. There's a big battle to decide, are we going to have another round of COVID relief spending? So a lot of the who gets what is what we often talk about. But one of the most important things that political scientists like to focus on is the how, the rules of the game. How you do something can actually affect the outcome of an election, for example. And I like to use a football analogy. Not that long ago, the extra point in professional football was I believe the 2-yard line. You had a very high 99.3 success rate. They moved it back a few years ago, and you had now a 93% success rate. So you change the rules, and then you have more misses. So the rules can affect the outcome. So that's the example I like to use when we're talking about how the rules can affect the outcome. So photo ID. So there's this idea of voter fraud is promoted primarily by Republicans. It's not just Donald Trump. The Republican Party has pushed it for a decade or so. They really pushed it since about 10 years. And so the reason why this is a Republican-led effort, kind of similar to what Gabe was talking about earlier, is Republicans benefit when they drive down voter turnout, especially who they drive down. So if you think about having a photo ID to be able to vote, if you live in an urban area, St. Louis, Chicago, New York, you may not have a car. You don't need a car, especially in big cities like New York. You wouldn't need a car. In fact, a car is expensive, so you wouldn't have a driver's license. So if you don't have an ID, you can't vote. And in fact, it's actually Texas, when they passed their photo ID law, they actually specifically allowed hunting licenses to be used for ID. So you could use your hunter's license, but disallowed college IDs like the University of Texas. And that's because younger college students tended to be Democratic and hunters tended to be Republican. And so you can actually manipulate the voter laws. So photo ID, a lot of the reason behind photo ID is who it benefits. And in this case, it benefits the Republican Party. So if you're looking at people who live in cities, people who are poorer, people who are minorities are less likely to have photo ID driver's licenses. So here we go. So adults without a valid photo ID, you can see a very distinct difference in groups. And so if you look at whites, only 8% don't have that. Whites overwhelmingly vote Republican, blacks and Latinos, and Asians are kind of split a little bit, but blacks and Latinos tend to overwhelmingly vote Democratic. So vote by mail. Gabe talked about vote by mail. Again, different views. If you look at this chart, this is a Fox News poll released last week. Democrats in Florida have almost, well, not quite 2-to-1, 70% more mail-in vote requests in Florida, more than twice as many in North Carolina. Let's think this clip will play.
Democrats lead Republicans by hundreds of thousands of requests for mail ballots in 2 of those 3 states by more than 2-to-1. Joe Biden is leading among women, suburban voters, seniors, and minorities. President Trump's support comes from men, whites, rural voters, and veterans.
So again, this, if you look at why you see a Republican push to limit voter by mail photo ID, you can see there's a reason for that. I won't go into this. Lisa was talking about it very nice. She did a good job explaining this. So again, President Trump is, this is one of his infamous tweets claiming that there'll be massive fraud if you vote by mail. There are problems with vote by mail. Fraud is not really one of them. I'll talk about one of the problems. I actually have concerns about vote by mail, not fraudulent issues, but other concerns. So again, you see kind of what tagging on nicely with what Gabe was talking about. This is why you see Donald Trump, just so upset. You see this push, be very, very afraid. A lot of Democrats are suspicious that the reason why the post office slowed down the mail, took out all those sorting machines, was a way to make it difficult to vote by mail. In fact, I will point out one thing that just adding on to what Lisa was saying about vote by mail. Yes, vote by mail is fine in Missouri. You have to have a notarized, but make sure you get it done well before the election, because Missouri is one of those states where it has to be received. Kurt Barr, if you want to see it, Kurt Barr did a nice presentation a couple days ago. He's in charge of elections in St. Charles County through Democracy Days, and he talked about this. It has to be received in his hands by election day, 5 p.m. on election day. So he has to have it in the mail. So with mail slowing down, if you're going to vote by mail, I would vote 2-3 weeks early. I would not wait until the last week to send a mail, because mail has been very erratic since we had these machines. I think there were sorters in Kansas City and Springfield that were removed from the post office. So again, who knows why? It doesn't make sense why you would take those out, but the Trump administration said it had nothing to do with trying to slow down mail, but it certainly seems like it would slow down mail. So my big concern with vote by mail is actually not fraud. It's possible there were some, I think there was an example, I think of the 2018 election, one Republican candidate in, I'm going to say Georgia, but I could be wrong on the state, was actually caught. Actually, his son was, he was caught hiring someone to do fraudulent vote by mail. He was caught. Again, if you try to cheat with absentee ballots, you're going to get caught. I mean, it's pretty obvious when you can do it. And he was caught, and they actually had to do a redo of the election. And I think he actually withdrew his name after his son even turned against him when his son realized what his dad was doing. So it is technically possible to commit voter fraud by mail. It is, but they are, as Kurt Barr said very nicely, you're going to get caught if you do it. So, and don't, I know Trump said vote twice, but that's a crime. Please don't vote twice. Don't vote by mail and then show up to vote. That's a crime. That's voter fraud. So there are ways to spoil your ballot, but you just absolutely do not do that. It is voter fraud. I think it's a felony in Missouri to vote twice. So don't do that. If you want to vote by mail, great. Do it 2-3 weeks early. If you want to vote in person, great. Wear a mask, as Lisa was saying, wear a mask. But one of my real issue with vote by mail is actually it came from one of my students a few years ago. She was from Oregon, and she told me this story of how her parents, she and her brother were 18, over 18, and her parents, and Oregon had vote by mail. They sent all 4 ballots to their house, and they sat down together, and her dad kind of helped them all fill out their ballots. And basically he kind of filled out 4 ballots essentially. And they all did it together, and she just said, oh, whatever my dad told me, I put down. Or even, I think she said at one point, sometimes he even just filled out the ballot and she just signed it. Well, that's actually voter fraud. And it was she certainly didn't mean to do anything illegal, but you shouldn't vote for somebody else. And my issue is really more, if you have an abusive spouse, you show up to the polling place and you say, sure, honey, I'll vote for Joe Biden. And then you can go in there and vote for Donald Trump, or vice versa. Whereas if you're voting by mail, there's no privacy. Your spouse can make sure you're actually voting for who they want you to vote for. And so I do worry about some issues of vote by mail, but it's really not a matter of I really like, I'm with Lisa. I really like the tradition of voting in person. Certainly not electronic. There's all kinds of problems with that, but I really like that issue. Oops, too far. So one of my issues with what I like about vote by mail is it actually makes it easier to vote. Election day is a Tuesday. We often work. You only are legally allowed a 3-hour window to vote. So if you have a 9 a.m. class, you have 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. to vote. You're done. The problem is in certain counties, especially counties with less money, where there's more poverty, you have fewer polling places, because as Gabe was saying, polling places are expensive. And so if you have fewer polling places, that means you have longer lines. And I know in some elections, there have been lines that are literally 3 or 4 hours long. So if you take the bus to the polling place, you get there. So it's an hour to, maybe it's 45 minutes each way to get there to and from work. Okay, so you have an hour and a half to vote. Well, if it's a 3-hour line, you either lose your job or you vote. That is literally, because the company only has to legally give you 3 hours. Now, if I were king of the world, I would make election day a mandatory holiday, like the 4th of July, or have maybe I would change Columbus Day to change that, get rid of that, and have election day be a national holiday that way. But we certainly have very low turnout rates, and a lot of it's because of the working class, working people, people with kids, people who have 2 jobs. And so, if you work one job from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., another job from 3 p.m. to 10 p.m., you can't vote because you got 2 jobs, so you can't vote. So we really put a lot of obstacles in America to voting. And so as much as I prefer going to the polls, I think we need to figure out another way to make it more accessible to people. And we have very low turnout rates. If you look at our turnout rate, we have very, very low turnout rate, among the lowest in the world in democracies. Most other countries have much higher turnout than we do. So again, I do have concerns with making it too easy. Electronic voting is a horrible idea. I don't even like those electronic machines they use that don't have a paper trail. I think they're just a disaster waiting to happen. You can't do recounts. So, vote by mail, concerned with privacy. But there are reasons for these things. Why do we have restrictions? Why do we have registration deadlines? Because, bureaucracies need time to verify voter information. So the reason why we have to register 27 or 20, a month before the election is so that they can verify that you really are who you say you are. So the elections are safe. Again, if you don't believe me, watch Kurt Barr's spiel a couple days ago. Elections are safe, they're secure. There's not an issue there. But I really do, there's a reason why you have these rules. I just wish we could actually make it a little bit easier to vote. Again, secret ballots, I'm a big fan of that. I don't like ballot selfies for the same reason. Your spouse could threaten you and you could say, I'm going to do a ballot selfie. I think most ballot selfies are perfectly normal. There's no attendant voter fraud, but I'm just really concerned about that. So to end my spiel, campaign rules matter. You can affect the outcome. Voter turnout is affected by the rules. Elections are on a Tuesday, not a holiday. A long campaign process turns people off. Who can vote? The rules affect whether we have photo ID, registration requirements. Now, the photo ID law was struck down, at least temporarily. But as long as you have, but you have to have some kind of ID. For example, like you could have your voter registration. What Lisa was saying, she brings in, you could have that, or I think they even allow like your bills. I think if you bring in your gas bill or something like that, I think they even allow that as proof of who you are. But I typically bring my little card, and so I don't need to have anything. But if you don't have any of that, then having an ID is what they're looking for. So I don't think you have to have a specific photo ID, but you have to have some kind of proof of who you are. In some case, either a bill or that little card they mail out to you a week beforehand. Okay, so I think now we can actually have some discussion and questions. If I'm sure there are a lot of them.
Yes, there are. Well done, my colleagues. You've done a great job once again in drawing out the context and explaining things clearly and cogently. One question that comes in: how can we encourage our peers to vote? Because as you've just pointed out, voter turnout is not what it should be. What can people do?
So my response to that is, people like to do a lot of complaining in this country. We are very good at bitching. If you don't vote, you didn't do anything to make things better. So you kind of lose your right to complain. And I would use that as encouragement. I would also show people things that have happened in the last 4 years, both good and bad, that have either hurt you or benefited you based on voting. Like your ability to make things better or worse for yourself or the people that you care about is in a democracy like ours is largely dependent on you exercising your right to vote.
Absolutely true. This was a question that came in early.
Michael, can I?
Oh,
add
please
on
do.
one thing?
Yes.
Yeah. So one of the things I agree with that, but I also really want to say, you know, it's the rules matter. I mean, really, rules on how we do things. The fact that it's a Tuesday and it's not a holiday. I mean, I would love if I were me, I would, if I were king of the world, I would say election day, at least the federal election days every other year, is a national holiday. Everyone gets off. We have barbecues. We go vote and we celebrate. We sit around afterwards and drink beer and have a barbecue. And that was how I would do it. Other countries actually pay people to vote, or alternatively tax you if you don't vote. I think it's Italy. You have to pay I forgot how much it was. It wasn't much, like a $20 an extra fine when you pay your taxes. You get like a $20 tax break if you vote. If you don't vote, you don't get anything. So encouraging people to vote. But I think really the biggest issue is access. I think we make it difficult for working families, working people who are, get multiple job. We're living in an economy with multiple jobs, and we simply don't make it accessible for people who can't get to the polling place relatively easily. Because you're asking people to spend literally, if you're in certain neighborhoods, you're literally taking 4 or 5 hours to vote, and sometimes it's crappy weather too.
Gabe, did you want to add anything to that?
Lisa and Paul stole both my good ideas, so thank you.
Something I do want to say before you move on, Michael, we don't have, as political science professors, we don't have any controls over the rules, but we can make suggestions to our peers. And a suggestion that I would make to my fellow faculty and the people who have power and staff: give students the day off that day. Give your employees an opportunity to go vote, no matter who they plan on voting for. If you really believe in democracy, you believe in both sides having the right to vote. And like you said, Paul, voter turnout is low because there is an access problem. And we can't fix the laws, but we can help fix access in our small corner of the world. So there's that.
Thank you all. A question came in early in the session, and I know that you've addressed this along the way, but maybe some summary points about checks and balances in the system of voting. How can we be assured of not only a free and fair election, but a clean election? What would your summary points on that be?
I think in the United States, compared to a lot of other countries in the world, the United States has a very transparent and open voting process. In almost every county election board in the U.S., you have to have a mix of people from both of the major political parties. So anytime you're going to open up a box full of ballots, there has to be a registered Democrat and a registered Republican in the room at the same time. The idea that widespread voter fraud is happening in the U.S. on a regular basis, like we said already in the talk here, there's no real evidence for it. Vote fraud does occur in the United States, undoubtedly, but there's no evidence it's occurring on a widespread basis. And the mechanism of voting, I believe, is scrupulously fair and honest. There's never been any reports that I've heard in any recent decades here in the U.S. of people working at polling places or people who help count the ballots being in any way acting illegally in any way or trying to skew the ballots one way or the other. So our process and our system is set up to be an extremely fair and open process.
Thank you. We've got a comment. I wish a lot more people became involved in the political process. In my city council ward, only 4.2% of the 15,500 residents cast a ballot and voted in the Tuesday, August 2nd, 2020 election.
So primary elections are way less participated in than general elections. And in my opinion, this is one of the biggest problems with our systems. People always get upset that they're choosing between the least of the two evils. when they didn't themselves weigh in on who ended up being those two people. If you had more people weighing in throughout the process, maybe we wouldn't be so unhappy with who we ended up with at the end.
And actually, again, talking about the structural issues as well, and the rules, I think we vote too often. I mean, think about how many times we go to the polling places in a year, 3-4 times a year typically. And a lot of countries you go once every other year, once a year, maybe once every other year, once every 2 years, once every 4 years. So by going in it, what's cool, because we elect school boards, we elect state reps and local reps, and it's kind of neat. But sometimes I wonder if we get, if we vote too often, and maybe we could squunch those into a fewer number of actually trips to the voting booth. Maybe, once a year, perhaps you could elect all those offices, and you'd have higher turnout, because local elections typically get way less than 10%. School board elections are probably the worst. You're looking at 2% for two school board elections. Those are typically in April, and you just no one shows up in April. But so I think, but in presidential election, we typically get, I think I just said, between 50 and 55%, which is a decent but not great turnout, but certainly.
Yeah, I would hope for more.
Oh yeah, I'm with you. I think more, but certainly
When you
better than
consider
60%.
how much money is spent, how much airtime is devoted through the news and through political commentary programming, and still 50 or 55% feels like kind of a failure in my estimation.
When Paul mentioned how long the electoral process is, they've been campaigning since last October, and election exhaustion is a real thing. Like, a lot of my friends who are politically inclined are just done. And if we did it maybe more like the United Kingdom, where they had 2 or 3 months to campaign and that was it, maybe people would be able to stay engaged and excited longer.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
Go ahead. There's a couple of, with the thing about cutting down our election season, the Supreme Court would be very unlikely to allow that to occur. They have a very expansive view of the First Amendment, to the point where I agree it would be a good idea, but it's not going to happen in the United States anytime soon, probably. And as to Paul's point about local elections, America has more elections per year than any other country on earth, period. And there's a reason for that. That's intentional. Local governments a lot of times put bond issues or tax increases on those spring elections, those local elections. The only thing on the ballot is some school board elections, maybe city council, and we want to sell some more bonds, or we want to raise sales tax. And they put it on that ballot because they know fewer people show up in April to vote. And the kind of people who do show up will be people who are more concerned with government and more likely to support something like increasing taxes a bit, like a sales tax increase, or selling more government bonds. I personally think it's a little underhanded, but when we want to look at who to blame on that one, look at your local governments. There's no reason we couldn't have our mayoral and city council and school board elections on the November ballot, just with all the other elections. Do it all at once, on one ballot. But it's intentionally done by local governments to try to kind of manipulate the outcome of a lot of these elections.
Well, and I totally agree with you, but I also think it is overwhelming how many things we vote for. I mean, not so much the last couple of rounds, but in some years, the ballots are pages and pages and pages. You're voting for judges, voting for this amendment and that amendment. There's going to be a new amendment. There's going to be amendment 3, right? It's going to be on the ballot.
I think that's right. Yeah.
Amendment 3, which is going to overturn, which is an attempt to overturn what the voters approved on the end of gerrymandering, which we voted on in 2018, and gerrymandering. It's now going to be voted on to overturn what we voted on in 2018. That's going to be on the ballot. So again, because we have it's a much more participatory democracy. We vote on so many more things, and so there is a reason why it's nice to spread it out, because the ballot's not that long. But it would be to go against what I was saying earlier. It could be a really long ballot if you have all those local issues too.
Another question has rolled in. Is there a political theory to explain the difference in voting patterns between Democrats and Republicans?
And I had mentioned during my talk that it's been shown for a long time that Republicans just seem more likely to actually show up and vote than Democrats do. And I don't know if there's been a lot of research on why that is. Why is that the case? My suspicion would be the Democratic Party tends to appeal more to working class people and people who have a lower level of education, people who are poor, right? And those people may be less likely to vote in some ways because, like Paul was saying, they may not be able to get off of work for long enough or something like that. Higher education levels are highly correlated with turning out and voting more. The higher your education level, the more likely you are to vote. So that could be a factor there. But like I said, it's interesting in that there's a big size, this is beyond the scope of this talk, but there's a big seismic shift going on in how people vote in the US. And the white working class, with President Trump in office, the white working class is gravitating more and more to the Republican Party. And a lot of white middle class and upper class voters who used to vote Republican don't like President Trump's policies. Some of them are peeling off and say they're going to support Joe Biden this year, which is why I said, like, the old theories about, increased voter turnout always benefits Democrats might not be true anymore, because the way different groups of Americans are voting are changing.
So there is a set of data that exists out there. It's called the American National Election Survey. And it's done every 4 years. And it was investigated in a book called The American Voter Revisited. And it was from the 1990s. It was a book that I had to read in graduate school, that a new edition is coming out very shortly. And a lot of those, why do certain types of voters vote certain ways, that's all covered in that book. So I would encourage people who are interested in the whys and wherefores of the American voter to look at that book. It's really, really interesting. It's very long, just disclaimer, that it is very interesting.
Very good. When voter fraud occurs, is it usually on the local level as opposed to the presidential level?
Well, there, I think there are maybe a handful of cases every year of voter fraud. So voter fraud is not as rare as a unicorn, but it's close. I mean, so there are, it's very rare. So the only way, because it's so rare, the only way you can actually affect an election is a local election. I mean, you're not gonna, Florida in 2000 was one of the really extremely rare examples where 540 some odd votes determined the presidency. Normally, I think the close elections in 2016, Hillary lost, I think, Wisconsin by 5,000 votes. That was extremely close. So you're not going to have 5,000 people voting twice. It's just not going to, you might have some idiot doing it a handful of times, trying to get caught or whatever, but that's not going to matter on a national election anywhere. But in a local election, it's possible you might see that, 2 or 3 people cheating might actually sway it a little. There was an example of that in St. Louis, I forgot what city or county, a few years ago. There was some voter fraud going on. They actually had to do a re-election because it was caught. Again, voter fraud at any kind of scale is almost always going to get caught, and they have to redo that. But it's only going to affect a local election. It's not going to affect a national or presidential election.
And when voter fraud does occur, it's almost always just an individual doing it, or at most a very small group of 2 or 3 people. In recent American history, there's been no major conspiracy to try to engage in vote fraud or rig a vote in some way. I think partially because, like Paul said, you're likely to get caught. And if you do get caught, rigging an election is going to be a crime punishable by a long term in federal prison. It's a severe federal crime. So when vote fraud does occur in those rare instances, it's just an individual or maybe a very small group of people working on the local level, trying to change the outcome of a local election for, I think, the reasons Paul said.
Very good. When violation of Chapter 115 revised state statute, state election law occurs, how do you file a legitimate complaint to be really and logistically investigated?
Okay, somebody's gonna have to tell me what section 115 of the Missouri State Constitution is, because I've not memorized the entire thing, I hate to say.
I'm actually looking for the question so I can even see it.
Yeah. Well, maybe more generally speaking, if
Yeah.
we as citizens see improprieties or believe that something
Mhm.
amiss has occurred, what do we do?
The person I would go to first would be your county election board. In just about every county in the United States, you have a person who heads the election board who's in charge of running and the elections in that county. Under the Constitution, elections are run by the state governments, but they almost always delegate that authority to the county level. So find the name of that person. In St. Charles County, it's Kurt Barr, right? Find the name and phone number of that person and get in touch with them. Call in, email, whatever you need to do until you get the person's attention and say, hey, I know of some people who are trying to fraudulently cast ballots or whatever's going on. And like I said, I do believe that the people who run our county election boards tend to be scrupulously honest people. I really do believe that. And if you bring it to their attention, they're going to look into it at that point.
I've got another good question. Why is there so much emphasis on closing polling places instead of increasing the number of places where we can go cast a vote?
I think that gets back to that thing about when you see polling places being closed and put in less accessible areas. This year, there's a good reason for it because with the COVID epidemic, you have a harder time getting people to volunteer to come work at polling places. And traditionally, if you vote much, you've probably seen this. The people who work in polling places tend to be older people, and they're the ones most at risk from COVID. So this year, a lot of states and counties actually have a pretty good excuse for narrowing down the number of polling places they have because they just can't get enough people to agree to go out and work. Like Lisa said, you get paid pretty well for working in a polling place, but it's a long work day. I think you get in at, it's 5 or 6 a.m. and you're probably going to be there till 8 p.m. So it's a long day. And they have a hard time finding people to work there. So I think that's one of the reasons. In other years where you've seen polling places closed, it's usually in Republican-dominated states or Republican-dominated counties. And to be blunt, it's probably a move to try to reduce voter turnout for reasons we've talked about before.
Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, I am really concerned. I know with COVID, there were some real concerns. Oh shoot, what state? I forgot which state it was, but there were local elections in, maybe it was Kentucky, I forget where, and they closed a whole bunch of polling places for COVID reasons because they couldn't get enough poll workers. So the problem was they couldn't get poll workers, and so they closed them down, and the lines literally were 6 hours long to vote in person. This is why, I mean, this is why I'm so worried. This is, about voting in person. Normally, I'm with Lisa. I think voting in person is the greatest thing since sliced bread. But in this climate, I mean, if something goes wrong, if there's an upsurge in COVID cases, people all of a sudden say, I don't want to show up. And so you have to close polling places. Then you have to go try to figure out which polling place is yours. And you go to the usual one and you have to get another taxi to go from one to the other. And it could just be a nightmare, which is, again, that's the biggest reason why normally I hate vote by mail. I think it's a terrible idea, again, for privacy issues and whatever, not for fraud. But this year alone, I think it is voting, not on election day is a really good idea, just because you worry, you don't know what's going to happen in November, what the COVID situation is going to be like in November. And that's my concern is, and we very well might close election polling places if there's people are afraid. And these people tend to be older, these voting, working at these polling booths, and they are the most susceptible to COVID.
And if I may follow up on a personal perspective, I think if anyone really believes in American exceptionalism, that exceptionalism should be conceived in part as founded on our democratic system, on our capacity for free and fair elections. And knowing that we're in a once in a century pandemic, I'm somewhat dismayed that there hasn't been a push to expend resources to make voting as safe and as accessible as possible, even during this once in a century pandemic. Now, Kurt Barr, the director of elections of St. Charles County, spoke to this forum on Monday afternoon and mentioned getting CARES Act support. The CARES Act filling in a lot of gaps in finances all over America. And I was glad to hear that because, for instance, he's ordered an ungodly number of styluses so that they can be individually used and then wiped, and there's enough styluses for that part of the act of voting. And I'm dismayed in seeing that, okay, we do have CARES Act funding, but we shouldn't be closing polling places. I agree with the comments that have been made this hour that we should expand opportunity and make that even inclusive of a national holiday. So I'd like to know if you think we as a nation are doing enough to protect the safe right to vote.
No, we are not.
Yeah, if it were me in terms of funding, if I were in Congress, I would give every poll worker, I think they get 120, at least it was like $125, something like that. I forgot what it was to pay for you
don't
sitting there for 14 hours and that's it. I would give them, if I were Congress, I'd say, we're going to give you $500 on top of whatever the state gives you for being there, risking your health. And then if I were me, I'd say, if you're waiting in line more than an hour, you get $100 an hour for if you're in line more than an hour, you're going to pay you $100 an hour to vote in an election. So that if you're having to wait 4 or 5 hours, you're not going to lose your income, because otherwise you often have to take a day off work and you lose income. So I would pay people to vote if they have to wait in line more than an hour, and I would pay poll workers a whole lot of money, especially during a pandemic, to risk their health to be there for 14 hours on election day. I think that's a long time. I couldn't do it. I have back issues. I can't imagine sitting down for 14 hours in these uncomfortable chairs.
Well, and going back along with what you said earlier, Paul, we should be making mail-in voting easier. I would be okay with mailing ballots out to all registered voters, and it doesn't count until you get a notary sign it anyway. So I don't see anything wrong with making it. I mean, mailing, like you said, mail-in voting is the most cost-effective way of doing this. And so if we did get CARES Act money, let's use it in the most scrupulous way we can. Let's make it easier for people to vote and not harder, and safer.
Yeah, I mean, my only issue with notaries is that generally poor people don't know notaries. So, I mean, middle-class people, rich people, yeah, I have a friend who's a notary. I can go to my bank and get it notarized. And that's what I did for my daughter when she was voting absentee. I went to the bank and got it notarized. But she had to be a customer there. So again, even if we shut out people, lower income people, and I think it's unfortunate, but there it is.
Yeah, I think that's true.
We got a comment from one attendee. Republicans in my county advocate voting unmasked to discourage people from voting to avoid COVID risk. I don't know if you want to comment on that comment.
I don't doubt somebody somewhere put that up on the internet and said you should go out and do this. I've not heard of a widespread effort to do that. I believe in a lot of polling places, I live in St. Charles County, and they're required in all indoor spaces. So I don't know how the laws work exactly, but I believe in St. Charles County, they could actually refuse you entrance to the polling place if you weren't wearing a mask. St. Charles County, I don't believe, has such a regulation right now.
Kurt Barr decidedly said that because there is not a mask mandate, he cannot compel voters to vote with a mask. And there's been some stuff in the news about whether and to what extent election workers will be wearing masks.
Mm-hmm.
I just noticed that I was called out for being the Oprah of voting. You get a car, you get $100, and so yeah.
Yeah. Well, we've been at this an hour. I think this has been some great stuff. I didn't know if anybody had some summary points. Maybe I'll offer a political perspective and ask for a final comment. I am very dismayed at seeing our president call into question the legitimacy of voting. And I think, reducing people's conception about the integrity of our system is incredibly damaging. And I see this as an abject failure on the part of our president. And I'll say it just in those terms. It's very dismaying to me to have so much advanced questioning about the legitimacy of a vote. I think it's incredibly damaging to our democracy.
Remember, though, to be fair, Trump is only a symptom of the actual problem. This kind of rhetoric has been ongoing for the last 12, 15 years. He's just parroting things that he's heard from other people. I will reiterate, elections are safe. Your mail-in vote is safe. Your absentee vote is safe. Your in-person vote is safe and will be counted. Do not let people in the media, do not let people in the administration, do not let people in your family tell you that your vote doesn't count, because it damn well does.
And this is where local elections, it really does count more. I mean, Missouri, it's probably not going to matter in the presidential election because it's probably going to go for Trump. But in many local elections, congressional elections, state rep, state senator, those races are often very close. And I would love to change how we do the elections. But yeah, your vote is safe. And again, whether it's in person, if you can deal with the lines, online, I mean, not online, God knows how, not online, or a mail-in, I think your vote's fine. Your vote's safe. It's secure. They do a good job on that.
And I would concur with both my colleagues here. I think the vote is very safe and very reliable here in the US. And if you're interested in government and the way it works, yes, I absolutely encourage you to go out and vote this election, however you choose to do it.
And if you do choose to mail in your vote, or if you choose to mail in an absentee vote, make sure that you request your absentee or mail-in votes now, and you vote as soon as you get it.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Gabriel. Thank you, Paul. And how about a round of applause for our man, Nick Wallace, for enabling these live video feeds. And thank you all for attending. And these questions and comments in this session and all of our sessions this week, they've been terrific. Thank you for participating in Democracy Days as presenters, as panelists, and as attendees.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.
Okay.
And thank you, Nick.